Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's been a while since we've done an Angular meetup. Today's a sort of a special occasion for Rangle and for myself personally. It's 8 years as of today that Rangle officially started. So at the time, I was looking to meet other Angular users and went looking for the Angular meetup, and there wasn't one. So I started it and booked the first Angular meetup. And the idea was to really, focus on Angular in the Toronto community. It was one of the first, Angular meetups in in the world. This was in May 2013. So I don't know how many people have been using Angular since 2013, but Angular really landed on the landscape in December 2012. There was an event in Europe where the Angular core team presented Angular, and it started to really get a lot of traction. And there was a few frameworks at the time. Backbone, Ember was popular in Angular, but it quickly became a focus on Angular and Ember at the time. In that first Angular meetup, we had it in person, and we had 250 people show up. So we had 250 people in seats, and I think we probably had about 5 different Angular meetups that went over 200 people. And then over time, with the evolution of Angular, the meetups sort of dropped in frequency, and we thought, though, that there's a lot going on, and it would be a good time to sort of step back in. For myself, I didn't really have slides, but I was going to talk a little bit about Angular and the evolution of it, and the impact over the last 8 years. I think the interesting thing at the time was HTML5 was just getting enough device penetration at over 90% that progressive enhancement of websites could be officially dropped, and we could start building apps just to run in the browser. The evolution of that has been something I find it hard to believe that Angular 2 launched in September 2016. So that was 5 years ago, 4.5 years ago. And the number of years spent on the first version of Angular is actually much less now. From a Rangle perspective, the evolution of JavaScript was fast and furious. We started building AngularJS applications in obviously 2013. and 2014 and 2015, we were evolving the stack we were building on a monthly basis because of the speed of innovation in the community. And then React came out, and we adopted React. I think it was 2016. Also in 2016, when we went to the first React Europe conference, and the introduction of Redux into the market. The evolution of Angular since then has been really interesting. So in Wrangle's business now, we're probably about 50% React, 50% Angular, and that's held steady for the last 6 years largely. So it's been an interesting trend. We do a fair bit of Vue, but that's smaller, and it's popular, but not at scale. And so, we work on Vue projects. It's probably less than 5% of the overall sort of business. One of the interesting things we've seen over the years has been, and this is, I think, a general insight. Programming's hard, and most of it's the thinking that goes into it. So no matter how much you build out and solve for frameworks and tools, it still requires talented people who are making good decisions and a strong focus on quality. The learning journey on Angular has always been pretty significant, and that's been one of the things that we've witnessed. The training and the onboarding and the learning, and that's been very exciting in the evolution of Angular in terms of more support for schemas and the CLI and the ability to get large teams working in a similar way. But the fact is, the learning journey is still there, and the ability to build the right components and the right abstractions and evolve a code base and stay focused on sort of the core quality elements. The last 3 years, the more interesting sort of space has been in the evolution of Angular and development processes into the design system space and the ability to support the end-to-end design and development journey. And what's been really exciting is the ability to take the design space with tools like Figma and the evolution of tokenization and atomic design and extend that into the Angular world, where developers working can work in the same space as designers. So if you're working on something and there's something that you want to enhance or change or evolve, you're working in the same sort of conceptual space, from what's actually implementing the design versus what is happening within the design and prototyping tool. And I think that's going to have a profound effect on the Angular landscape moving forward and in development in particular. From over 8 years, we actually launched our Angular practice in December 2015 with the beta. We thought, once the beta went out, the expectation was the release would come out fairly quickly. And that proved not to be true, and the router got rewritten, I think, 4 times in 2016. By the time Angular had been released in September 2016, I think we'd done over 20 programs, with Angular in the beta format. And as we were working on our Angular training materials, we sort of accidentally wrote an Angular book, and we put that out there, and that's the AngularTO book. Following Wrangle's open source sort of philosophy, we made it Creative Commons. We put it up on GitHub, and we made it sort of publicly available. And there were some great stories that came back from that. One of our developers learned how to do Angular in Belgium using our books. We went into an account 3 years ago, even we were long past Angular 2, and they were still using it from an architectural reference perspective. And it's with great enthusiasm that we're rebooting that book this year with a focus on sort of production scaled Angular projects. So the rewriting of it for Angular 11, and with the tagline "Better late than never." So that should be coming out over the next few months. But from an overall perspective, I think the Angular community and the evolution of the tool and in the large client base that we work with, it's been an amazing journey. And Rangle is effectively built on what Angular brought to the development community. It's was our core passion and focus, and it's what brought us together as a company and brought us our clients and sort of helped drive our growth over the years. And with 2021 and the market and our continued work in the Angular space, I'm looking forward to the next 8 years. And we're actively building some of the largest, most interesting Angular projects, I think, in the world. And we bring a relentless focus on quality and scalable architecture. And over the next 8 years, I think the end-to-end integrated customer experience building of software is going to be quite exciting, where everyone's running, working together in cross-functional product teams, building applications, and everybody's designing and building as a single team. I am not a very active practitioner anymore, so I don't have a lot to add on Angular architecture and practices. And for that, I am going to turn it over to our next 2 speakers. That's why I don't have a lot of slides. Just really thought it would be interesting to reminisce over the impact of Angular and the growth of it and the scale of it. With that, I think I will turn it over to the people who are actually going to dive deep into the actuals of modern Angular and practices. So with that, there we go.
Hey Nick, thank you. Hey, hey everyone. Let me share my screen before I get started, and then we can go from there. Uh, so hope everyone can see my screen and the browser presentation, right? Um,
Yes.
okay, awesome. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Sumit. I'm a solutions architect at Rangle, and like as Nick mentioned, it has been 8 years, and frankly, like it has been like 7 years I've been at Rangle, and I've totally loved all of those. Yeah, continuing. So today we'll be talking about effective state management for the components. So let's get started. Before we begin, let's talk about state management. Now, state management simply means a way to manage the state. It can be for your whole application or a subset of your application. Today, we'll be talking about the state management for your components only. Now, in every application, you have like various kinds of components, but there are mainly three types of those. First, the page or the container components. These are the components which wrap your whole page or a route. They are the ones which are connected to your application store and pass down properties and events to the nested components. Next are functional components or shareable components. These are the ones which can be reused across different pages or small sections. They can range from small to large in complexity of the business logic. So example could be a header or a footer that reuse across your different pages, uh, which which are like not that complex, but then there could be a contact us component which is a bit more complex and has a bit more business logic around it. And third would be at the smallest level are your UI components, or often referred to as dumb components. They are only confined to displaying the information based on the data they are passed, or bubbling up the events when an interaction happens. Today, we'll be focusing on functional components which vary in complexity from medium to large because they are the ones that require more state management. Now, how do you manage the state of those components? There are different ways to do that. You could create a shared service that is created when you create the instance of the component, and then you are responsible for managing the state of that service. Other approach could be singleton as a single source of truth and use that within your components itself. But then but what about redux? Like if you are already using some sort of a redux library in your application, and you are already familiar with action, the selectors and create reducers, why don't you use a library that is specifically targeted for this purpose? So if you want if you want you can use an ngrx component store which is based on ngrx state management library. Now let's see. Now ngrx is one of the ways you can manage the state of your application using the redux pattern. You have your store which is connected to your reducers. Your components dispatch actions which updates the store, and then you have selectors which are used to select data from your store and update the component. And then you have effects to manage the side effects within your application. Now, what if you could use the same pattern for your components? So for that, you can use ngrx component store. ngrx component store is similar to ngrx. It's a state management library specifically targeted towards the functional components. What it means is, if you have a functional component, instead of managing the state of your component within itself, you can extract it out in its own store. It does not depend on Ngrx component store and can be used independently, as it totally self-contained. Now, every store needs to perform some sort of basic operations, which are read, write, and have some sort of side effects when needed. In Ngrx, you have create selector to select the values from your store, create reducer to update values to the store, and create effect to manage the side effects. Similarly, in ngrx component store, you have select to select the values from the store, updater to update the values from the store, and effects to manage the side effects. There are additional state modifiers which you can use if needed. Now, other major differences between NGRX component store and NGRX store are component store are usually spanned over like small single files, and then also the NGRX global store is spanned over the lifetime of our application, whereas component stores are only to the lifetime of that particular component, so you can easily reuse them across the application. So let's see a demo for that. So I'll stop screen. Actually, before we jump in, let me give you the demo of the code that I have. So here you can see, so I've created a demo for a store where it's just a header component. Then you have a filter. Now you can easily assume we can reuse this filter at multiple places within our store, either on right, left, or any other place. And then you can switch between the different filters. It updates the categories of those categories based on the gender that you have selected. You can select the particular categories, sizes, colors, and as well as price range, and click on select. It displays those, and you can click on filter to go back. Now this is a pretty complex component because it is doing two things. One, it is changing the data when you update your main category, and then you need to keep changing the filters as you select. Right now, it would be good if you can easily manage the state of this particular component using the patterns, as I already mentioned, which is ngrx or something else. So let me show you the code for that. Let me share my screen. Okay, so here's the code for that application. Let me zoom in a bit. So all the code, first of all, like ngrx component store does not depend on ngrx, so it's a standalone library. So if you would, you can see in package.json, I have only included ngrx component store. This was you can remove this. Yeah, you it just needs to rely on ngrx component store. Okay. Now, so I've created a filter component that I already shown. It consists of a few components, which is a checkbox that you saw in the browser, and then a title, which is basically just the title that is shown there. Most of the code is within my mode ngrx store service. Now, before I dive in, let me show you the modal. So I have created a filter state which consists of gender, categories, sizes, and colors, and price range, and then all the selected values for each of these. Now at the start of the application, I go and select make an API called to select the filters and populate them, which is here. Okay. Now, so I've defined my model. It's now what about updating the state of that? So everything is done inside my store filter service. My store filter service extends my component store, passing in the type of the store that I want to manage. In here, I want to manage my filter store, so I have passed it down. I'm initializing some predefined values. So I'm setting like what is my default filter. I start with the kids. I have all the none of those values are defined right now, and also the none of the selected values. So I initialize them with the default values. What it will do is it will just set my default values to my store service. Now once my store service is initialized, I make an API call to get the data from an API. Now here I'm using a service that is provided in the root of the application, getting those filters by gender, and then getting the response. And in here I'm patching the state. Now patch state is one of the functions that is provided by Ngrx component store. So instead of manually setting the values, I'm just patching all the values that I get back from the API. And if there's an error, I'm just returning with an empty observable. So this was about setting up the state. Now let's see the UI. Now once I have values populated at start, what about changing those filters? Now as I mentioned, you can have selectors as well as actions within your component store itself. So so after the constructor, I create selectors for each of my values within my store. So I create, and each of these is returns an observable, because under the hood it's still using RxJX as an observable library. So I can create selectors for each and every type, gender, categories, sizes, colors, price range, and all that. And you can already see it's so easy to manage the state of your component. You can extract all of your business logic from your component to this store filter service, and then write and reuse it at multiple places. So now these are all my selectors. They correspond to the similar selectors that we'd use in Ngrx. And yeah, these are all the selectors. And after that, I'll come back to this view model. And then these are all my state update function. So which is set categories. So here what I'm doing is whenever whenever a category is updated, update the values within my state. Same with sizes, colors, price range, and then same. So whenever you click on a checkbox, so I see if the checkbox is checked, I update the selected categories and push the new category. If not, I remove those categories from the from the array, and then update its state. And here also I'm using the same patch state method, and in similar way select sizes, select color, and so on. One additional thing is, so one of the recommended best practices by Ngrx is, instead of returning the instance of your services, you create a view model for all your observables as well as selectors and functions to set the state. So in here I'm just doing creating a s- view model observable, which is combined of all the pane of the nested child observables, and just setting getting the values and passing it down again. It you can also use those directly from the service, but this is one of the recommended practices in there. And in if I go in my component store in HTML, you can see, since view model is an observable, I get its values using async operator and assign it to VM, and then I'm directly using values from the view model as if they are properties defined within my class itself. So vm.gender and setting as well as calling all the methods directly. So store filter service dot select category, right, and then it updates the values from there, and then in similar manner the other values. Let me go back to the presentation. Yeah, so it's basically the same thing. So I update, it basically updates the view model of my application. uh, in this way I'm abstracting all the business logic from my view layer to my ngrx components. So now this is one of the basic examples, but you can easily extend it to any of the components you like. Now, uh, why you should use ngrx is basically there are a few advantages of that. It allows you to create reusable reactive state stores which can be independent of the global ngrx store. Avoid mixing concerns between the local and global stores, since this component can be reused across multiple across applications. I don't have to, and the state of this is only confined to this particular component. I don't have to pass all these filters to my global ngrx store, because once I select them, I don't need, like, this should be the value that probably should be stored in my ngrx store rather than including individual filters over here. Provides better alternative to, like, yeah, as I told, like, you can do all these things in simple services as well as using behavior subjects, but with using ngrx component store, it allows it provides you all the methods that you are already familiar with, and you can easily use them. And then with the component store, you can easily reuse the complex components by creating multiple of those. And as you onboard more people, it's easy to manage the states because they are already familiar with the patterns or the library that you are already using. And that's about it. Any questions around this one? Uh, does anyone have any questions around this? Or if not, I think we can pass to Jason, who will be is our next presenter. Jason.
Hi. So my name is Jason. I'm an architect for Nrwl, and I live downtown. So if you hear some sirens going off, it's because I live right in the middle of a police station and a fire station. So they're all doing their jobs. But I think you should be able to hear me fine over them. But I apologize for the sound. So I'm going to go ahead and start up a presentation. Alrighty. So I'm going to talk to you today about scaling development across multiple teams with Nrx. So for this presentation, let me full screen this. Okay. First, I'm going to go into introduce myself, and then I want to get to know the audience a little bit more, and I'll be looking at the the chat so you can spam there, I guess. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about monorepos and what that has to do with scaling your development across multiple teams. And then I'll show you more about NX and the live demo. So my name is Jason Jean. You can follow me on Twitter at Frozen Pandas. And 2 things about me that are that I work for Nrwl and I work on the NX core team. So Nrwl is a company, we consult for Fortune 500 companies, and we're experts in monorepo development. Our founders are actually ex-Googlers, Victor Sofkin and Jeff Cross. So I guess one of the creators of Angular, right? And then we also develop DevTools to accelerate development for our clients and other people. One of those tools is called NX. NX is an open source development toolkit that allows you to develop many different types of projects in a monorepo. It's also used by Fortune 500 companies, such as our clients and a lot of big companies around the world. So now that I've introduced myself, I'd like to get to know some of you. How many people work for a company that has a backend and a frontend app? I know this is an Angular meetup, but I imagine the company itself does more than that. Hey, lots of people raise their hands. Okay. And then how many people have like multiple apps in their company? So like you don't just work on this like one website, you work on like maybe like a storefront page, but then you have like a separate cart application, some kind of deal like this. And maybe even a backend API, right? Cool. I think Zoom's raising the hand is like messing up with my computer's focus. Does your company have more than 25 developers? I think that's a pretty sizable team. Awesome. And then does your company have more than 250 developers? Couple of hands. Cool. So if you've answered yes to some of those questions, NX is built for people like you. But I think everyone can learn something here, even if you're just working on like a small page. If you're just getting started with Angular, I think you can still take these ideas and apply them to a project of any size. So with that out of the way, I want to talk to you about monorepos. And before I tell you what a monorepo is, I want to tell you what a monorepo is not, because there's a lot of misconceptions out there about monorepos. Oops. So the biggest misconception about monorepos is that they're a monolithic application, and they're not, right? If you've been developing for a while, we used to develop apps in like Java or like .NET, and they used to be these huge API applications that were really hard to split up. And in the engineering or like in the mechanical engineering world, I'll say Rocket is kind of like that. It's such a big project, and you can't really test it out. You don't build a prototype of a rocket before you launch it. You have to build the whole thing and then you launch it. And that leads to very complex projects, which a monorepo is not. So a monorepo is not built all at once. You can build part of a repo. I'll go into more detail after. And then it's also not deployed all at once. So you can actually deploy some of a monorepo. Okay. So now that I've gone through some misconceptions about monorepos, I'll tell you what a monorepo is, or at least how I'll define it. A monorepo is a single repository that contains multiple projects. So like people that said that their company works on multiple different apps. Some of you might be working on one app in one repository and another app in another repository. But if you were using a monorepo, it would be a single repository that contains both of those. So I'm going to make the analogy to a warehouse for code. When I think about warehouse, I think of a lot of packages, and they're packed separately. You know, everything's in its own little box. They're stored together. You know, there's like a huge warehouse full of shelves of like individually packed boxes. And then as they need to get shipped out, they get shipped out separately, right? Like you don't just ship a whole warehouse to somebody. You want to ship one box at a time. So when I think about monorepos, I think about projects. And just like packages in a warehouse, you develop these projects independently. but you store them all in one repository. And then when it comes time to deploy each individual application, then you deploy them independent of one another, right? So warehouses, packages are pretty much like monorepos and projects. And I think this is also a good analogy because a lot of times what works for a small shop, right? Like if I'm just a mom and pop shop, like I can just use the back room, like a storage closet to store all my stuff. And I might not even put things in boxes because I can find everything really easily. But then when I go into like a big store, such as like maybe Loblaws, right? Like they definitely have a warehouse that has like a central collection of all their packages. So they have to do things very differently. They can't just put things in a closet in the back. So that's how I think of monorepos. As your company starts to scale in terms of developers and the amount of projects that you're working on, you don't want to store everything the same way that you used to. And then I just want to shout out like some people that use monorepos, and it's actually all of the big companies. They've all kind of gravitated towards this method of storing their code. People like Google are very they pioneer a lot of the stuff that happens here. Microsoft also builds Windows itself in a monorepo, and like Facebook has one giant monorepo for all their front end code, and so on and so forth, right? So it's not just like it's not just Google, and it's actually all these big companies that have a ton of developers and a ton of different projects that are working on. They've all gravitated towards using a monorepo. And let's take a look at why that is, right? So why use a monorepo? And I'm going to start off the conversation kind of like as a startup that just develops one application. So when I develop this one application, I probably want to split up some of the code into different parts, but then I'll put it all into one repo because like I'm just working on my first application. There's no need to really split things up in any other way. And then, I'll work on my one part of the application and I'll do all the tests for it and make sure that everything looks good. And then I'll deploy it, right? And then you're going to want to share code later on. Like you're going to start developing your second application, maybe a backend, and you're going to want some of those same pieces of code. And now you come into like a fork in the road. Like, do you add them into the same repo? Probably not, because that would make the build really slow, right? So what most people decide to do, or what some people decide to do, is that they decide now's the time where we want to split everything up into different repos, right? Now that they're in different repos, now we can point to a project from the cart application and then from the store application, I can point to the same thing. And I can usually like upload these projects to a local NPM server. All right. And so then you also decide you want CI to run on everything. So you duplicate your tooling across all these different repos. Not only do you have to set up a different GitHub repo, but you also have to set up a different NPM. Like you need to deploy to NPM, and then you also need to set up CI jobs so that all their tests run whenever you make changes. Then you're also going to have separate workflows. So back in the same situation, now I just want to make another change to my one little section of the page, right? And now that I work on this, I can run these specific tests, but everything else is stored in a different repo. And I have to go into that repo, run those tests, and then make sure I go into the other repo and make that test run, right? And now I can make sure that everything works together. And this seems better than what we had before. So if you remember what we had before, we had to test everything, right? So like the project on the left and the right or the bottom, we had to test those, but now we don't. But we have to like go into multiple different places and make changes, and then we can do those tests. And then I also want to talk about out of sync dependencies. I know everyone just saw that like Angular 12 was just released. It's a really big release. But your own code has its own versions as well, right? I'm sure if you're publishing local versions of your own packages, you might have some projects that depend on V1 of something very core, and then you'll have another project that depends on V2 of something core, right? Or like V1.1. All these packages evolve at their own rates, and we kind of follow the same pattern that we see in open source, which is like I release a new version, and then you can choose when you want to upgrade it, right? But if we zoom out the picture, we realize that the app up top that uses the library that uses v1 of the bottom library, like down here, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Someone raise their hand if you could see my cursor. Awesome. So we have this library over here that uses v1 of this bottom library, and then you have the library over here that uses v2. And you go and build this application, right? It's a very innocent application. It uses two different libraries. And then you end up with both version 1 and version 2 of that library, right? This used to happen all the time for jQuery projects, but you can actually have the same thing for your own internal projects. So this could happen with Angular as well, right? Like this cart application is very up to date. You're like, oh my God, Angular 12 just came out. I'm going to go ahead and update this application right away. And this library down to like the left again, like they're a little behind. They haven't touched it for a year. Like it's pretty stable and it still uses Angular 10. And then this other application, the store, maybe like they have a bunch of bugs that they need to fix and they're still on version 11. So your company and all these different parts of your company are using different versions of Angular, and it could be tough to find the right version or like even find the right docs for when you're working on it. So now I want to talk again about sharing code, and I want you to kind of remember what I just laid out, and maybe you can you see this in your company, but I want to talk about sharing code in a single repository, right? A monorepo, and I'm going to say it's the less complicated way, and you'll see why. So for the first thing, you only have to set up tooling once, right? This one repository, you only need one GitHub repo and you only need one CI process. You can add more projects to here and you're still not going to have to set up more tooling. Same with NPM, like you pull to one NPM and you don't have to set up like a local registry for each one. And then your workflow is also kind of back to what you had before. You're able to just go into your specific project and you're able to work on this thing. And then in the same time, you're able to work on the application that uses this library and run the tests for all those things. And then everything also lives at a single version. This is very important for what we just talked about with the different versions of dependencies. But basically, whenever you make a commit to the repo, you can make an atomic commit. So the whole repo moves to like the new version of head, and there's less ambiguity about like which version are you using. Now you can still have a branch that's like out of date and is using a like an earlier version of it, but if you update your branch, then everything will be at head again, and there's much less ambiguity. And the same thing goes for Angular. Angular, you can update all at once. You can make sure that it works with all the applications that you build with Angular, and that can be done as a whole for your organization. And so I'm going to summarize a bit. We looked at multiple repos. A lot of people probably do something like this today, and then I talked about monorepos, where everything's all together and there's less duplication of different things like different dependencies and different different tooling, right? Like everything's in one place and the workflow is simpler. And now you're just kind of like shooting yourself in the foot. You're like, why did I do this? Why did I split up all my stuff into different repos if monorepos are just simpler, right? And I guess the most obvious reason is because people think that their builds get slower, right? And that their tooling is kind of focused on like per repo, so they need to split up their stuff in different repos. And so at the end of the day, when I think about why to use a monorepo, sometimes I think it might be a pedantic argument. Like, why are we talking about how we store our code? Like our business, our revenue doesn't care, right? Like as long as we get to ship our applications, our users will be happy and will make money. We like making money. But I think if it's not because of the code, I think it's because of the people. We're all, or like most of us are probably developers, and we work on projects and we try to deliver value to our customers. And so I think of most of our work is actually the people, right? And how it's stored. I like to think that we should store it much like our company. Your company might have different teams, but all in all, like everyone's part of one big team that's trying to deliver value to their customers and maybe make more money along the way. So now that I've talked about monorepos and I've given you a good idea about the idea of a monorepo, I want to talk to you about NX. So NX, first I'll go into an overview, and then in case you already use NX, I'll go into some new features or some new things that we've done in NX so that everyone gains a little bit from this talk. So an overview of NX. NX is a powerful and extensible dev tool. We support not only Angular, but also React and like soon to be like different languages as well. And I want to go into different pillars of NX. So one of the first things I want to talk about is modern tools. There's been a lot of talk about like, should we move away from Eslint? And if you already know what came in Angular 11 and Angular 12, they actually removed using Eslint from the Angular CLI, right? And they tell you to go to the community and to use Eslint. And NX does this for you. And not only does it do it for Eslint that was removed, but they also removed Protractor. So we've, for a long time now, we've defaulted to using Cypress. And then I want to talk to you about an intelligent build system that NX has so that all of these different worries that people have about like their builds getting slow, they can be not only remedied by like doing less, but way smarter, and like the caching can be way better. And then I want to summarize it about how this allows you to develop efficiently at scale. Like for those companies that have 250 developers or like 10,000 developers, how a monorepo is almost necessary for you to be able to scale that efficiently. So for the first part, I want to talk about the modern tools. So NX is actually, I'll call it a la carte, right? You don't have to bring in every piece of NX. We support Angular, React, Next.js, Nest.js, Express, Storybook, like all of these things are supported by NX, but you bring in one piece at a time, right? So if you start your organization and you decide React is the way to go, and you bring in Nrwl React, you can start using NX and build a React application. But then if you rethink your life and you want to use Angular, just kidding, like React is fine. But if you want to use Angular, you can bring that into your application. Some of the tools that NX uses under the hood are Eslint for linting. This is a pretty standard linter now. The React ecosystem has used it for years, and Eslint has been deprecated. So I hope everyone knows the story there. Jest is a unit test runner made from Facebook. And Jest is actually the unit test runner that they had to make so that they could run their Facebook monorepo like full of unit tests, right? So it's a very scalable tool. It's very delightful. Like the watch mode with it that I'll show later is really great. Way better than Karma. I don't see many reasons to stick with Karma. The one argument is that like Karma tests run actually in your browser, whereas Jest runs in Node. But all in all, I think Jest is a way better tool for a lot of the unit tests that we write. Storybook. So if you've heard about design systems and kind of like the new strategy people use when develop UI components in isolation, Storybook is a fantastic tool that lets you kind of view your, let's say, button component in isolation and then make different adjustments to it. Maybe like, what does a big button look like? What does like a secondary cancel button look like? And Storybook allows you to quickly iterate on all that and share that with your designers or your product owners, and they can see in isolation the different building blocks of your application. Cypress is a end-to-end test runner. So Cypress allows you to not only run the same kind of tests that you can run with Protractor, they're way easier to write. They, sorry for the sound, they're way easier to write. And they also have like a really cool timeline feature that they have that you can kind of jump into the states where the end-to-end test failed. So you can see kind of what the application looks like at that time. And then I want to talk about how NX is intelligent, right? Because now that we have all these different projects in one place, number one, we should be intelligent so that we don't kind of run everything at once. Otherwise, it'll be really slow. And the second thing is that like we can actually make sense holistically about our organization now because it's all in one place. You could do this if everything's split up into different repos, but all like by and large, the tooling is not there and it's way more difficult to build when you have multiple different repositories. So if I take a look at this code right here, I have let's say some component here, and I need the product component and the product state. So I go ahead and import these two things. And in code, this is very obvious. Like I'm importing different pieces of code, right? So Nrx takes a look at this and can generate that, let's say the card application here is bringing in product component and the product state. So this is all inferred for you. You don't have to kind of like write this out, which a lot of other build systems do. Then we use this information and we show it back to you, right? Like I would love to see like how my organization has like how the work that I'm doing affects other people. So if you run Nrx Dep Graph, you get this lovely picture of you see the products on this corner. It uses the product's homepage, also the product detail page, and then they share some UI. And not only do they share some UI like way down the list, they also share like some types as well, right? So you can do this for your whole organization now that everything's in one place, and you can see that like you can focus in on different applications. So this really allows you to visually explore different parts of your code base. Now that we have this graph, I want to talk about something else that we do called affected. And this is basically a way for you to take what changed in Git and kind of highlight the different projects that need to be retested or relinted and all that stuff, right? So if we take a look at the graph, we can say that like, oh, I made a change to the homepage component. I need to go and test my homepage component, but then I also need to test my products application, right? This is stuff that I think humans keep track of a lot, right? Like you make a change in the code and you know that like the products application over there needs to be retested because, last time that you changed the products homepage, things broke. So you need to go and test whatever broke. But computers are way better at doing this. So you don't need to guess that like the cart page will or will not be affected. The computer will know, right? Or like Nrx will be able to tell you. And then I want to talk about intelligent build system. When a lot of people think about monorepos, they think about monorepos that might build everything at once, right? For our initial example, when we were building one application, we tested everything whenever we made any change, right? Even if we might know for a fact that it doesn't need to be tested. So like build tools like Lerna use this kind of like just put everything in one repo and then we'll do everything for you in like a organized way, right? And when you do something like this, you have all these different projects that you always have to run, and it takes like a long time, right? Like 60 minutes per se, like just for an example. But with affected that we just saw, we can actually say that like we don't need to test some of those applications, right? We can cut maybe 35 minutes off right off the bat just by not doing useless work, right? If that code doesn't change, we don't have to test that code, and we're able to automatically tell you that like these are the projects that you have to test or that you should test to make sure that your application still works. Now that we're able to slim down the amount of projects that we're doing, we can also do it in parallel. In our Monorepo, we've split all these different projects up into different little pieces. They each have their own individual tasks. So we can actually, let's say, split that across our two CPUs on our computer, or like, if you have a, I don't know, a Ryzen 9 or something, like you can have 24 different parallel cores all computing stuff in your Monorepo. Not that it's necessary, because we've already slimmed down the work from like 60 minutes to 25 minutes, but it's definitely good to start running things and using all of our CPU power, right? And the next step for that is to actually distribute the build across many different agents. When you go and push a PR up to, right, like you might have Jenkins take a look at that PR and run all the tests. And we can actually distribute those individual tasks over to many different agents. So you can have 5 different agents, and if you've only affected 5 projects, like each of those agents can work in a distributed fashion, right, across different machines to get that work done faster. So let's say in 6 minutes, right? But we still have this like one long task that takes 6 minutes. And the only way we're going to get rid of that task if we need to do it is if it's able to be cached, right? So that's the next thing that we can do. We can actually cache our previous builds. And this might seem like just like way over engineering for like your one repo that builds one app. We don't need to cache that one app. We can just build it again. But for a monorepo, as it scales, like when I pull down a monorepo, if I want to get started quickly, I want to just be able to like serve production, right? So we can actually cache the previous builds and get this down into a more respectable like 2 minutes. So Nx can, for example, like some of your 60-minute builds will no longer be 60-minute builds. They're more likely going to be like 10 minutes or 6 minutes or like 2 minutes. So I've actually seen this like ballpark numbers transform an organization without waiting like 60 minutes for every PR to be checked. They're able to merge a PR after like 2 minutes as long as it's a small change. And that's life changing for some companies. I think the most boring thing that I do all day is wait for CI to run. And like making that run faster is a huge lifesaver. So now that we've learned about all the different things that NX can do, this really helps you develop efficiently at scale. So it lets you develop one team, or it lets one team develop one app, but then it actually allows for multiple teams to develop many different apps. And I think companies will go in this direction, right? Like a lot of people already said that their company not only works on one app, they also work on different apps. And you have so many different teams work on different things, and NX really helps you get there. As I described before, it allows you to use monorepo development, which is a holistic develop experience. So you don't have to jump from one development experience for one part of your organization to a different repo. You actually have a holistic view of like your whole organization or your whole like larger project, right? That you're able to get a view of. And a lot of people will be begging the question like, oh my God, like don't do that because like code will start depending on all these different types of code and you'll just end up with a what's known as a big ball of mud, right? And NX also helps you control this. So, for instance, if we have these two different projects and one is state and one is UI, and one of the core rules that you might be familiar with is like we should not depend on our state from our UI, right? So when someone tries to make this dependency, we actually have a lint rule that says like, you don't want to do that. Your state project should not depend on other projects that have a UI tag on them. And so you can control which projects can depend on others. Another example of this is like, if you have a cart state that you only want the cart application to use, you can have like the products app like restricted from requiring that in. So this actually like enforces a best practice within your organization to not depend on stuff that you shouldn't depend on. So I've gone through a lot of different things about NX, and one last thing before I go into a demo and to show you all these things for real, right? I just want to go through some new things that we've done in the last year that I find very exciting. So very recently, Angular 12 was released, and we were able to release a version kind of the day after that supported Angular 12. So we're right there with the Angular team. We've always been pretty close with them. So yeah, Angular 12 support, super exciting. Also, migrating from Eslint to Eslint. We have a schematic that you can run to convert your Eslint projects into Eslint. You have the option of taking your Eslint config and all those different rules that you've built up over time, and you're going to kind of get the same Eslint rules for that. So that is probably the closest thing to magic that I've done in the last, like, I don't know, 6 months. But we understand that a lot of different people or a lot of companies they need a path to transition from Eslint to Eslint, and an announcement that says like you should just go like figure it out and rely on the community to do it is not good enough for us. So we have a schematic to help people with that. We also allowed for people to distribute their CI builds. So normal companies, they'll push it up to GitHub and then it'll go off to Jenkins or like Circle CI. And we've worked on distributing that across multiple different agents in a very simple way that doesn't take much setup. So that is something new. And then for a bit of kind of like geekiness, we started building NX with NX. This is a very fun project to work on. Doesn't really affect the a user of NX, but it makes developing NX way simpler, and it's just kind of cool that we're able to build NX with itself. Also, we wrote our own dev kit. So if you ever written an Angular schematic, I was one of the first people that wrote Angular schematics, and I found it very difficult. And if you know Hans, who initially came up with the design for Angular schematics, I think the only reason why I personally know how to write schematics that well is because I grabbed him at ngconf, and I was like, hey, can you explain what this tree is and what merging changes means? But we've made that way simpler. So like if you're writing your own schematics, take a look into NX generators. It's basically a simpler version of Angular schematics. And also in the same vein for Angular builders, we also have NX executors. So this is a simpler way to write, I'll call it like a simpler way to write Angular builders. Most people probably don't have to worry about this, but if you've tried and you found it difficult and unnecessarily difficult, then check out the NX dev kit. You might be surprised at how easy it could be. And then this is really exciting. This is project graph plugins. So I mentioned earlier that we were able to take those TypeScript imports and infer our project graph off of it, right? So now we have made that pluggable. So you can actually write a project graph plugin that it doesn't analyze TypeScript, but it analyzes Go or Java, right? So we've opened this up and made it pluggable so that we actually have a repo that shows Go projects being automatically analyzed and put into an NX graph. Alrighty, that is it for that section. I will go into a live demo and show you some of those things that I was talking about. So I have to stop sharing that, and I need to share a different screen. And all right, you should all see an editor now. And the first thing I want to show you, this is an example repo that's on GitHub. It's called NX examples. But the first thing I want to show you is this dependency graph, right? If I imagined I was in the audience right now, this would be a brand new repo that someone's just showing me on screen. Now I would really like to know what this looks like. So, some architect might have a diagram somewhere in Wikipedia or your internal wiki, but I can actually show you all the different dependencies that go on in this project, right? And if you're a newer developer, and let's say this is like a legitimate corporation and you only cared about the products application, we can easily focus in on that and see all the different projects that are involved. And if someone tells you to work on the homepage, you can continue drilling down and seeing pertinent information to your workflow. And this is all done in the same repo as the cart application, right? So if one day I decide I need to move teams and go to cart, I can go and view all those things, right? And you'll find some things that you might share, so on and so forth. And this is a very powerful tool that you probably have a graph like this in your head. But trust me, I've found some surprising dependencies that I've had between projects before I've done something like this, right? And it really opens your eyes and helps you enforce best practices within your organization. So that's really cool. I'm going to show you some other stuff. I talked about caching, right? And how long does it take you to do a develop or a production build of your application, right? Especially if you have a large application, it could take minutes or an hour, right? Because I've already done this on a different machine, right? I can do NX build products prod, and that ran almost instantly. And I'm actually able to see a report that comes from NX Cloud, which I didn't really talk about, but you see this lovely interface where you can see that you've actually got a local cache hit. So this means that I've already done this on my machine. And now I kind of want to show you what it looks like if I am new to the repository, right? So if I remove all my node modules, it'll be like I checked out this repository for the first time, right? And I'll just give you a hint that the cache, the local cache that we hit before, that was in node modules. So now I'm going to install dependencies during a live talk, which is always exciting. Meanwhile, I'll share that this project uses Jest. So we have our Jest config here. It uses Prettier, it uses Eslint, and this is all set up out of the box. I don't remember the last time that I had to set up all these tools, but I remember that it was a long process, and every tool you had to go and read their docs and how to configure them. Nx does this for you out of the box. So we're almost done installing here and running ngcc. And now, I'm a new developer. I just started this company and I would really like to see production. Well, boom, it's done, right? And now you can see the same build that it got it from the remote cache hit, right? Super cool. You don't have to worry about kind of like onboarding process. You can just tell people to run the production build and they're already done, right? As long as it's been done somewhere else. Now that I've shown you how to build a project, I showed you before that there's two different applications in this this workspace, and you might wonder like, well, how do you run only just one, right? Do I have to build every single thing before I can start on my local development? No, you pass in whichever project that you want, and you're able to start only the products application, right? And not the cart application. So this will build only the products. That's not really exciting, so I'm going to skip that for now. ESLint is set up out of the box. So if you lint products, this will be using ESLint. It looks very much like the regular TSLint output, but it uses ESLint. And then if you run Nx test products, you get a lovely watch mode. So now that I'm watching all the tests for my products, I can go to my product, maybe we'll go to our products page, make a change into our app component. And we can see the test rerun automatically, right? And if we were to maybe bring in something that we shouldn't bring in, let's say constructor, and we bring in, undefined service. Then our test would fail, right? And we would know that we had to fix our code. So just makes that way simpler. I just realized that we probably didn't see all those screens that I was talking about seeing before because I forgot my whole screen's not shared. So let me just backtrack for a second. Sorry. And I'll show you the dependency graph that I was talking about. So this is the dependency graph that I was trying to show at the very beginning. You can see that we're focused in on the shared product state right now, and we know that the cart application depends on it, products application depends on it. We can go and focus the products. We can go and focus the cart. And like, again, for a new developer starting at a company, this is really nice to see. And even for like a seasoned architect or like someone that's been in the company for a while, this is stuff that if you ask someone, they will tell you a different story than what you see here. So a lot of the different connections here, I don't remember, right? This is just an example application, but you can see that like properly split up, even a simple application can become way more understandable to a new developer. I'm going to run a build again so that I can show you the interface there. So you probably saw before that a link showed up and I clicked it, but you can see it. So I'm just running another build right now. It is taking a while because I've made some changes that I'll get rid of. Okay. So you can see the interface here. You can actually show like, the different outputs that you got from the different projects, and it's all split up nicely for you. Sorry for the noise again. And then I'll show you the code again. One last thing that I want to show is Cypress. So if I want to run end-to-end tests on my project, I can run this in watch mode as well. And I'm going to stop sharing to see what Cypress looks like. If you've been using Protractor, I think this will really blow your minds because this is way better. Just waiting for it to be done. We will open up this, I think. Yeah. So you can see the different end-to-end tests that I've written. Clearly, I've not written a lot for this project, but I can click into a file and see what it looks like. So I can see that like it should display the header, which means it should go to the page. Then I can see the header right there. If I should say like display products, right? It goes to a different page and you can see all the different products over there. So this is a really nice interface. You don't have anything like this for Protractor. And, I think it's a silver lining of the Angular CLI removing support for Protractor and Eslint. And yeah, that's about it for my presentation. I guess I'll open up the floor to questions. I saw the Cypress window is missing, someone says. Did it come up eventually or? Yeah, does anyone have any questions? I'll answer any questions that people have. No questions? Am I not reading the right chat? All right. Well, if you have any questions that you think of later, you know where to find me on Twitter. It's @FrozenPandas. So you feel free to ask me questions there.
So, question for you: what would be the smallest team and project that would make sense for a monorepo?
Honestly, I would use it for any side project that I work on, right? Like if I'm doing my personal website, I would use a monorepo for it. I know that I'll probably put down my personal website for like a year or two, and then next year I'll come up with like, New Year's resolutions, and then I'll look at the code and I'll be like, what in the world was I doing last year? And this will allow me to see everything that I've done for my personal website. Like if I've written a back end, I want to see like what are the different parts of that, and if I'm running a front end, like so even for one developer on a personal website, like I would go with a monorepo over a like dividing it up into multiple repos. And I think that's kind of at the scale where like most companies or most teams think that they don't need to split up the repos, right? Like I think most companies start with a quote unquote monorepo, right? Like everything's all in one repo. But it's when they start to grow and they get their second application that they start kind of, I'll say, goes to the dark side, right? Like they're going to start splitting up their projects into different repos so that they can kind of get like more focused workflows, right? They can check out a different repo and know that they're working on this section. But it's just going to be way harder to integrate those changes at a larger scale. So yeah, the answer to the question is very small.
Everyone, and I guess practically speaking, a lot of large companies, if they adopt a mono repo and they haven't done it traditionally, their infrastructure is quite. I heard someone use the term heritage instead of legacy a few weeks ago. I thought that was very pastoral. But you basically then you might use a mono repo for your front end Angular sort of customer experience. You may, because there's just such a lift. But in your ideal world, it'd be more like the Microsofts, or like, do they do all in back end and front end, or is there a tendency to separate back end and front end still in larger mono repos?
Yeah, different companies definitely do it in many different ways. I think Google is the one that really puts everything in a monorepo. So they have a really sophisticated build tool called Bazel, which we take a lot of inspiration from, but it's way more complex to set up. But Google as a company definitely keeps a lot of their code all in one repo. So from Google search all the way to like YouTube or like Google Play Music, I don't know what they haven't killed yet, but they keep that all in one repository. But I know other companies like Microsoft, some of their projects, like they keep only their projects. So like Windows is in a different repo from, let's say, like Office. I don't know if that's actually true, but like I know that they are more selective about what they put into one repo, but it still allows them to work on the like entirety of Windows all at once, right?
Right. Well, the Russian hackers prefer it all being in one repo. So Microsoft was one of the ones hit from the SolarWinds thing, I think. So that was supposedly all the Microsoft's code got accessed. So, generally monorepos for everything. That's all the time, no matter the size of the team.
I'll share this though. I think a monorepo works less if you're dealing with clients, right? Like, there's no way that if you're like an agency, you're going to build projects for one client and then build the same project, or like build a different project for a different client in the same repo.
Yeah, they
Like you
won't do
might have
that.
to share that code with them. So generally, for those types of projects where like visibility is very important, right, or like the lack thereof, those projects would not work well in the same repo, right? I think it's still fine for an organization to not develop all their different projects in one repo. Even for like us at Narwhal, we have Nrx, which is an open source monorepo. We have all of our different plugins all in that repo. But then we have some internal or like not open source code that we keep in an internal monorepo. So there's times where you don't have to put everything into one repo, but the more that you put into one repo, the more you're able to holistically understand what you're doing there.
Right. So with the ability to look at all the graphs, but I guess also there's the from an intent perspective, you're forcing collaboration because everybody has a shared responsibility now to collaborate. So it's sort of like the it's an incredible forcing function of collaboration. You've got no choice.
Absolutely. So I know like a lot of banks, they'll have like a lot of different parts of their organization. They'll have like a a bank's kind of department that like actually takes care of their like savings accounts and checking accounts, and then they'll have like a separate credit card company. And like traditionally, I've seen a lot of banks like they're just all siloed off. They actually have like do not share information with like a different part of the company kind of thing. But bringing them into a monorepo is, as you said, like a forcing function for like you see and use the same code, right? And like any contribution that you make to that code, everyone gets the benefit from it. And it's very transparent. Like if you're making a change on the back end, a lot of times front end developers will just complain the next day and they're like, oh my God, my API call is not working. And if you can actually see in your repo like what has changed in your API call, then either the backend developer or like the full stack developer will have made that change for you, so you're not getting a complaint anymore, or you're able to see that like, oh, I get it, like you just renamed this one parameter or query parameter into a different one, so I'm going to pass that in now. So the transparency there is really important for collaboration, and I think for larger teams especially, this is, and it's invaluable, right? Like if you're running a shop with multiple different projects, you want collaboration between them, and this really helps there.
All right. Looks like there's a question. I love the depth graph, but honestly, in really big repos, it's hard to read it. Any tips?
Yeah, I definitely know what you're saying. For large repos with like 200 different projects, my tips right now would be one, to focus in on the parts that you actually want to see. So never try to look at the whole thing if it's too big. And then second is that we're thinking about stuff like this. So we will be making improvements to the depth graph and making it more kind of, I guess, higher level, right? Like a lot of those different projects that I showed in the depth graph are related to products. So one of the things that we're going to be doing is maybe not showing you all the different projects and how they relate to other projects, but like how groups of projects relate to other groups of projects. And then you'll be able to kind of look into like, oh, I see like my group of projects here relates to this group of projects here. and then you can kind of expand on that and see the individual ones. So we're definitely thinking about how to really visualize a large amount of information in a very understandable way. So we're thinking of things like that.
So with the thanks. So with the scale of this, is there like a unit of change that makes more sense in a monorepo? Like if a team's working for 3 months on updating their sort of library or their APIs, the change order effect of that is much more significant. Whereas if teams are, say, releasing daily, and it can more pure continuous delivery model, then the chances of blowing up too much is somewhat mitigated. Is there like a pace or a cadence or a flow that makes more sense, or at some point where you would sort of start to decompose into multiple repos again?
Yeah, so the change is a good concern, I guess. A lot of times people think that, oh, you have all this code in one place. Like, am I not going to get merge conflicts every time I try to merge like a little PR? Um, but I think, as you were saying, like more incremental and more frequent changes is the way to go. If you're working on like a new version of your library, like really like you might really think about like how do I stay backwards compatible? How do I like introduce this new feature in a way that makes sense for everyone? But the nice thing with the Monorepo is that like you can take those little ideas and implement them and see how that kind of ripples out of in a Monorepo. So design systems I think work fantastic in a Monorepo because you're able to see like not only the little application that you use for like looking at your design system, but then you also see like how the cart application uses the design system and how the product's homepage like uses the design system. And one of the flows that I guess like Google talks about a lot is what's called trunk-based development. So that's kind of a contrary, or like the other hand, people use feature branches or like feature workflows, right?
Yeah.
So like using a trunk-based development means everything gets merged into one main branch, right? Or one trunk branch. And then you can actually take parts of that branch and deploy it separately, or you can like use that branch as your like current state, right? So like all developers pull down their main branch and kind of work off of the code that everyone else is working on. So the more that you integrate that your code into that main branch, right, the more that your dependencies will test with your latest code, right? So it really doesn't make sense for you to wait 3 months and then push up like a massive change. Between that time, like all your dependencies will have thought that you're in the state for 3 months ago, whereas something very different. Like your dependencies in different ways, and staying frequent with that and
Yep.
smaller is definitely uh more favored, right? The other side of things is that for those like Angular migrations, right? When it's time for like everyone to move to Angular 12, you might think that like, oh, I have my one little repo, I can move over very quickly, right? Like I don't have a lot of surface area of Angular that I depend on, so I can move over very quickly. But overall, for your organization, like you're going to want to move to those later versions, right? Even for, let's say, products that are in maintenance mode, you want to move over to those um, new technologies, right? Or at least ones that don't have security flaws. And doing that all at once is actually beneficial. So on the other side of the changes, like you can have one huge change that moves everyone over to the next version of Angular. And you can have it done by like a specialized team that's kind of the best at thinking about like how Angular is used within the company. So Google does a lot of, ironically, Google is one of the companies that really stresses like how they use Angular inside, right? So like before they make any change to Angular itself, they take a look at how within Google that change would affect them, right? And if it breaks half the applications in Google, such as like Ivy, then they'll think extra hard about how to make that backwards compatible so that Google can move forward, right? But for your organization as well, like having that knowledge centralized is better for making those large scale changes. So
Yeah, so it sounds like, there's the book Accelerate, which talks about trunk-based development, and that with trunk-based development, you can scale to almost a infinitely large team, which I still find a little hard to wrap my head around. But it sounds like trunk-based development and monorepos sort of go hand in hand, because you need to be propagating changes quickly and maintaining the state of the whole system. And you'd probably learn that pretty quickly, because if you haven't really bought into it and you have a feature branch that you run for a month, you're going to be in a world of pain, probably trying to get that merged in.
Yeah, and I totally empathize with like I can't even imagine it. I think before I joined Nrwl, I couldn't imagine it either. Like I was the one that said, hey, we should split our stuff into different repositories and create all these small different projects. And look, it's so cool. Like you can just run the test for this project and it's super fast. And I thought that was like the way to go. But very quickly, I learned that joining Narwhal and working on these larger projects with like more teams, this really does open up more collaboration with other people and the ability to kind of understand the changes that you're making throughout the whole organization even better.
Yeah.
So you learn quickly. For those that are like, do I really want to move everything into a monorepo? You can do it step by step, but I think you'll learn the benefits pretty quickly.
And I guess, if you think about the broader network, it's all technical debt when it's not synced. So, anytime you have a change that's not propagated, that's technical debt. It's almost like inventory of change, and that's super expensive and ends up creating its own friction. So, well, very cool.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I think that's all the questions. That was a great talk. We really appreciate it, and it was very enjoyable. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Normally we would have beer and pizza, but not in COVID. Next time. So I think we're are we wrapped up? I think
Yes,
we
yes.
are. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you coming out. We're going to be running the Angular meetups more frequently. If anyone's interested in speaking and sharing what they're working on, and if anyone's looking for something new to do as well, Rangle is looking to hire some Angular development talent and UI architects. We're working on a number of interesting projects, as well as in React and Vue. So things are pretty busy. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.